Sorry for the delay, but we're here and welcome. So, my name is Yusim. For those of you who don't know, I'm part of the MDL sponsorship team. I'll just be introducing our next speaker, Ariana, who is a design lead at TWG, a Deloitte business, one of our sponsors. And she will be talking about how to sell your designs effectively. And now I'll just pass it on to Ariana to give her presentation.
Thank you so much. Again, apologies for the technical issues. Yeah, it's kind of brand with me. I'm a procrastinator and obviously try to get in really late. But in order to take the most advantage of our time, I'm just going to start jumping into this context. And this is my talk, selling your designs effectively. I know a few of you may have extensive background in design, and I'm sure a lot of you already know about storytelling. So just to give you a preamble of this, I'm going on the assumption that you're familiar with the art of storytelling, but here what I'm gonna do is bring us a few tools to focus it on how to do it for the design process specifically. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. I think we're gonna be interrupting to ask a few questions here and there, but if not, just follow what I say. All right, so what I think that selling your design effectively takes is just the art of storytelling through matchmaking and mind reading and using what we already know. And I'll tell you more about what these terms mean in this context. Let's start with, why do we storytell? Sometimes, especially for design, there's so many things we want to talk about, but what do we include? I'm that kind of person that if you see the mirror board that I created to plan this workshop, you'll be like, oh Lord, you'll be very overwhelmed. Let's use that word. But how do you bring it down to the key things that you really want to tell in your story? This is something that is done through storytelling. But before we jump into how to do storytelling, let's learn a bit more about what storytelling is. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to keep it at two levels. First, very general, but let's go in specific into design later. So storytelling is just communicating something. It's as simple as that. I'm not going to tell you like what the Oxford Dictionary says, what Nielsen Norman says. It's just communicating something. And you're doing it for multiple reasons. You could be doing this to share an emotion, to be remembered, to connect people, to share learnings. There's many reasons why we tell stories. But there are three key things that we usually do to tell our stories. One is simplifying complex data or complex things into something very easy to consume. A story is not just you sitting down and giving everyone every single detail about something. You already did the work of connecting the important dots together and guiding the user through the listener. You see, I'm a designer. The listener through the best path, the path that interests them, essentially. So you're simplifying. The second point is you're connecting people. Sometimes we think of how do I connect the story to the audience? And we might be in the situation in which our audience doesn't necessarily match the profile of who our user is. So for example, when we present designs, our stakeholders, let's say you're presenting to a stakeholder or a client, may not be necessarily the user, but you're helping them get in the shoes of the user. So you're connecting people. And the way that we connect people is usually through emotion, through anecdotes, right? So maybe the stakeholder is not the user, but they have felt frustration before. And so you're using those emotions as a way to connect people because they have shared that emotion at one point in their life, or you have been the hero, or you have been the villain, or you have been the underdog. So there's many ways in which stories can connect, even though you may not see it at the beginning. And lastly, you tell stories to inspire and motivate. You tell stories to get someone to think about something, to feel something, to do something. And that's kind of the intentional part about creating stories. It's what do I want people to feel, do, and think after the story ends? What action do I kind of want to create from this story? So, oh no, I jumped a bunch of slides. Let's see if I can get... Ignore all the stepping fast. Okay, so now let's take one step deeper. What is storytelling in design? Essentially, the way I see it, and let me just put again another disclaimer here, is that this is how I understand storytelling in my years of working in design, how I've defined this concept for me. This is not necessarily this those industry standards, but it's like a very common sense as how I see it. So in storytelling and design, it's about developing empathy with our users. When we're presenting our designs, we're usually telling the story of what our users want, what our users are feeling, how are we filling those gaps. And it's a technique that we can use to help others get in the shoes of our users, right? They're not in the room, so we need to develop that context, that connection between the audience who are looking at our designs and the people who will be using it in the end, the people who are really feeling the need for the changes and the improvements. Yes. So as I mentioned before, like why do we storytell and design? We storytell because there's many stakeholders, there's many goals, right? There's people, like clients, that want something, a business goal out of this. There's users who want like a pain point relieved. There's you who are trying to, get from like ambiguity to specificity. There's many people with different goals, and with storytelling, you're trying to connect the dots. You're trying to find alignment between what the user wants and what the other stakeholders are needing as well. So you're kind of connecting how their needs fit within the story of helping users. Again, user is always the center of the story. As I mentioned, is storytelling allows you to speak for whoever is not in the room. In many cases, I've done workshops in which I plan, and then people come in and start saying like, "Oh, well, I think my opinion is." I'm like, "Oh, interesting. Let's stop for a second. Let's remember who our persona is." And like we tell the stories like, remember our persona is that person is like has limited time and has like kids to attend to, and then right now they're asking really strongly for this kind of thing. So like you're kind of like resetting that mindset so that people can come to the sessions and provide feedback in a way that is meaningful. It saves time by focusing on critical points. As I mentioned in the previous slide, that is more about general storytelling. You're doing the pre-work of connecting the dots for people. You're not giving them all the details. That's not what presentation storytelling is for. It's you highlighting the areas that need to be paid attention to. And it develops trust and alignment. When you start painting the story, not only are you creating alignment between all of the actors in this process of designing and creating solutions, but also you're essentially creating the trust that like I'm hearing what the users are saying, I'm hearing what stakeholders are saying, and I'm reflecting it back to you. You're like letting people feel heard while connecting things together. I hope that this is making some sense. If not, I apologize. But feel free to ask questions so I can clarify later. All right, so now, so we know what storytelling is generally, why people storytell, what storytelling is for design, and why we use it. Like, why is it an important technique for us? But again, how do we do it? And this is where I say we leverage what we know. But where do we start? We know that storytelling as a whole has three key components. One of them is characters. The who are the people, or like the entities. I don't know, because it could be an animal in a story, it could be anything. But who are those individuals who are going through the story that you're following through a story? Then that also involves conflict. There's a struggle. There's something that like people, like you're creating a bit of like tension that will be relieved. That's another key component of a story. And then there's resolution, right? So like if you recall any sort of movie, there's also this tension building, and then all of a sudden something happens and you like feel that little physical feeling of relief, of like release, like that tension broke. And that's part, like a key part of the story. If you leave everything in a conflict at the end, again, maybe that's a creative technique for like films to get people like break the patterns of how people look at stories. But the general stories is conflict and resolution. So let's go back to a couple keywords that I threw in the first slide that might have been like, okay, what does this mean? The reason why I'm using these two words, because I think that to tell a good story, there's these two aspects of matchmaking and mind reading. Matchmaking, the way I interpret it, is understanding our audience's needs and connecting them with a story that they care about. So this is like truly going, understanding, developing empathy, doing our research to understand what do they want to really see. And then the other side is mind reading, is anticipating the questions the audience will have and connecting the dots for them. So in this case, it's like, how, as you tell the story, what are the questions that are coming up for the audience? How can you build a story that anticipates this so that people feel, they don't feel like they have to do that work of thinking and filling those gaps in their head? It will feel like a much smoother experience if you can do this ahead from them. But if we take a step back, these are two key components of something that we are very familiar with, which is the design process. The design process has these two components of empathy, which essentially empathy and anticipating and needs and problems, right? So the design process takes you through these 5 phases of getting from a really ambiguous place and using and like different creative techniques to understand your user, all the way to when you have something that matches their needs, right? It's something that they really care about at the end, right? And so the idea I'm posing here is like, if we have this framework, why not use it for something like this, for creating a presentation, for planning how do you want to sell your own designs? I don't know if you've seen this diagram before, but this is what the design process looks to me in my head, right? And to many people, because this is have been leveraged by other people. By no means I created this, but the design process helps you get from a really chaotic place where you have a lot of data, a lot of information, all the way down to a point where things are focused, things are simple, they're easy to follow. And so when we think about how do we tell a story about the design process, because that's essentially what you're going through, the design. This is super meta. Sorry, let me just stop for a second to acknowledge that. I'm telling you to use the design process to tell a story about the design process. Okay, so let's go back to the story. But yes, you're completing, as far as the designathon, for example, the design process to solve a problem. And now you're like, how do they tell the best story about this? And so when we look at the design process as a narrative, let's use this visual, we know that this all this chaos. And you can think of that as like the conflict of the story, right? You know, the characters will be you and the team, the users, but the conflict comes from that ambiguity that is at the beginning, that those like decision points that you have throughout the your path. And all the way, the resolution is when you get to that point where like, okay, we are all aligned that this was the best solution, it makes sense, it solved people's problem. That is essentially how I see how to tell the story about the design process. So if we go back to that slide that we saw before, essentially our characters in this case, and I'm being very specific about like how to tell a story about the design process in the context of your designathon. I hope that this is like the most valuable take I could have. But in this case, the characters are your users and your team. So you're going to be looking at like, what are the conflict points, not only for your users, because that's how you could build tension and empathy with the user, but also for your team. That also builds tension that could come with a resolution after to like give some, ups and downs to your story. The conflict, I know that the picture was just funny. I'm sorry that it's not necessarily violence, hopefully, within the story that you're telling. But in this case, conflict could be from the user perspective is what are their pain points? When you tell the story of a user not having something that prevents them from doing something else, that's something that creates a negative impact in their life, that's you adding conflict to the story, right? You're telling like there's this big hurdle that needs to be overcome. And so you're creating that tension and you're creating that anticipation in the audience of like, well, how will they solve it? So that's like a great opportunity for you to hone in, like that's one of those key pieces of the story that you want to hone in, like that problem and like making people feel the emotions that your users are feeling. But the other character in the story is your team, and as part of this designathon and many other presentations of this sort, like a portfolio review or like and things where you're presenting your process, the audience also wants to understand like how did you get to the end, like how as a team do you start, found that this is an interesting problem, and how do you come to your solution? And so you're kind of also telling us, we have a process, we are logical, we make decisions as a team, and you want to imbue those in your story as well. Like, for example, at one point you had only 2 hours to do research and you're deciding which is the best method for us. that's a conflict, right? Because you had to understand, as align as a team on like what's the best strategy moving forward. And you can tell us like, and we did these two things, and we at the end said, you know what, we're gonna go with this one. And you're building tension. At this point, the audience is like, okay, but was it the right one? Like, was it the best strategy? And then you tell us, and this is what we find out. It was so valuable because of this and that. So that's the other parts of conflict that you can imbue into your story from your team's perspective, from like the character of your team. And so the points of like any point of decisions, any point of misalignment that was like aligned, decisions that were made, those are great points to add as like conflict. And then the resolution is like, again, like the impact that created, right? Like, you know, you have the pain point conflict from the user perspective, and the resolution for that will be like, you know what, we had this aha moment when we put this tool in front of people, and all of a sudden they were saying, oh wow, this is exactly what I wanted. Or the other way around, where they say like, this is completely off. That's also an aha moment and a point of like learning. So it's just like, it takes us through that, like that building up of tension and releasing it. And from your team's perspective, again, as I mentioned before, it's like a decision that you have to make about a technique to use, and how that resulted in positive or negative impact, and then what you learn from that. Like that's how you kind of use that other like not narrative, like that parallel story to add ups and downs to the overall story you're telling. Oof, I think that got a little confusing, but I'll continue. So, as I mentioned before, I believe that using the design process framework for creating a story is one of the most effective ways. If anything, I don't know how, but I only came to the realization recently that there were some things in my life that were like, oh, I don't know how to solve this problem. And I was so blocked, let's say. And all of a sudden I'm like, wait, I have a really like proven tool in my hand to solve this problem. Like, what if I use that framework to solve things that are not necessarily just the products that I'm building, the things that I'm designing for other users? What if I use it for other parts of my life? And immediately started seeing results. Like, you know, we were doing some internal projects in our team, and I'm like, okay, let's use this framework. And now there's so much more alignment, there's so much more clarity on like how to move forward. So that's what I'm saying. Let's think how that process reflects in the process of building a story. So the first step of the design process is understanding, right? It's absorbing as much data and understanding of our user, our problem, our context. At this stage, when you're building a story, some of the questions that you want to have in mind are like, what is the goal? What are you trying to accomplish by telling the story? So in this case, for example, you know, as a Designathon student participant, you might be like, I want to win the Designathon. That's a pretty straightforward goal. I want to stand out. I want to show my process because it will help me get a job. Like, there are many different goals that you may have, but as a team, it will be interesting to understand like what is a key goal that you're trying to accomplish. Who is your audience? And this is the most important part around like using the design process for building a story, is creating that empathy with your audience. In this case, you have audience is not necessarily your user. Your audience is judges, is other Designathon participants, is mentors who are here to understand your process and how you went from a vague problem all the way to a solution that you believe fits the need. So when you think of who your audience is, you start asking your questions like, what do they want to see? What do they want out of this presentation? As a judge, I want to make sure that you did your due diligence. As a judge, I want to make sure that you, I don't know, followed a process. I want to make sure that you kept the user in mind at all stages. I want to make sure that you are aware of the holes in your logic, and then you are making recommendations forward. So like, it's kind of like, we want to see and trust your process. We want to see and believe that there was a logic that brought you from beginning to end. I'm not a judge, I don't know what I'm saying we want to see, but I assume that's something like based on previous Designathons and competitions like this. Um, Another thing that you want to establish at the beginning when you're understanding is you're gathering data, right? Not only about your goal, your audience, you're also gathering data about, the what are the constraints and limitations for this story that I'm creating. Like I have only this amount of time. I'm supposed to be, hitting the specific points. I'm not entirely sure if you got a rubric. Hopefully you did, but like generally, like you're getting like some of the things that you have to hit for the story. Yes. We're looking at the full process. Sorry, I'm trying to like multitask is the word. So again, for the understand phase, you're trying to gather all that data, being intentional about like, what do I know? What do I need to research more about? That's how you start planning your story. Then you go into the define stage. So before jumping into this define stage, you've already done as much research as possible. You've understood your audience. Even if it's not necessarily data based on real data, you can make assumptions about what your audience wants. But as a recommendation on that, if you are able to reach out to someone that kind of fits that persona of the audience or the judge, to give you feedback on like what would you expect to see here and there, that's a way of being resourceful and actually trying to get things that are based on real data rather than your assumptions. But with the lack of data and strong limitations, assumptions are a good way to go as well. And as a team, when you have four assumptions, you can also kind of understand what the consensus is. All right, so that was the understand. You jump into the find. You found many different questions the audience could have. You found many different things in your story, in many different points of your story that you could be telling. You could be talking about each of the techniques that you use. You could be talking about the outcomes of each technique. You could be talking about the findings of each technique. But how do you decide which points are the most important? And so this is where there's a need for criteria, there's a need for guidance to narrow down what you're going to be telling the audience. So of all the gaps that the audience wants to hear about, or all the different ideas, which one do we think is the most impactful? Which one do we think will create the strongest emotion out of our audience, essentially? Which one do we think is the riskiest? This is something that I've told a few designers based on what I've learned over the years about design, presenting designs, is that you're not here to show every single part of the process. You're not here to show. And again, sorry if you are expecting every single part of the process, please ignore what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that you're not going to methodically walk every person through every thought that happened, every piece of information that you put on a board, every iteration of things that you did. No, you're going to select the things that were the most impactful based on that model of like conflict and resolution, right? Maybe you do follow the framework of going, okay, we started with understand and we continued to define, then we went to ideate. But in understand, you did 4 things, but there was one that was key, one that created the biggest aha moment, one that gave you direction as a team. So mention the other ones and hone in on this one. Hone in on the one that created the most impact for this story. Similarly, on the define stage, let's say that like you did personas and you did a journey map, and turns out that from the journey map, it was the most impactful part because you talked to someone and you got this incredible quote that gave you a clear path into what the core gap was, let's say. So again, you have all these pieces to a story, but which one is the one that helped you move forward, that like was much more impactful in your progress? What was a point that if you hadn't done, the process would have been blocked? Those are things to hone in into. And so again, you're narrowing down, and this criteria of like selecting the parts that were the most impactful, the things that were blockers and you solved, those are maybe the points at each part of the process, of the design process, that you want to hone into. In other cases, for example, when I've presented designs in the past, we do like, you do a walkthrough of a prototype, let's say, but at the beginning, obviously I didn't know these things, and I presented like, okay, and this is the screen, and this look at the profile, and you click on the profile, and you'll do all these things, and then you click on settings, and you open the menu, and we selected the menu for this reason. Yeah, I'm talking a lot of things, and I'm sure I've already lost a bunch of you, because those are not critical things. Those were not critical problems. If I'm talking about hamburger menu, okay, hamburger menu's been around for a long time, unless that was something that it was breaking the experience before, and now you fixed it, and that's gonna create a much more positive impact. That's not necessary. Like, that's not necessarily important for the story. Something important for a story is when you introduce a new experience. Let's say people are used to doing ways in A, B, C, and you're gonna be like, you know what? It's gonna be A, F, G now. Like, you're changing things. That's important to a story because it's a risk. You're introducing something entirely new, and you're expecting users to learn something new. Or, for example, when you're removing something, like, oh, are we getting rid of this entire thing? And people are gonna be like, well, how are people going to complete that if you've got rid of it? So like that's risky. That's risky. Will lead to a lot of questions, and that's why you will want to include it in your story. Another way would be like, out of all the gaps, we focus on this one because it's the most meaningful. And that's, oh, I'm losing my train of thought. Yeah, choosing the what's most impactful. The last, sorry, that was like bad patch up, but I'll connect to the last question. Who can help you narrow down? Again, in the design process, one of the key things that we do to ensure that we're not just working silo and being biased is involving others. And the same way that we involve our users in a lot of different parts of the process, we can involve experts as well in this part of the process. So, for example, as part of making this presentation, I brought in a bunch of designers from my team, and we did an ideation. I'm like, okay, if you were in a designathon, what would you want to hear about? Like, what are some of the things that could answer, help them? And turns out that there were 3 people that had done designathons. So I'm like, interesting. You tell me what you wanted to hear. Like, what tools were you missing while you're doing the designathon? So in this case, if you can leverage someone, maybe not your user, but someone that has some expertise with the context of the story that you're going to say, bring them in. Get resourceful, try to validate as much as you can your ideas and your questions through people who are more familiar with the problem, the story that you're telling. Right. So step 2, define, helped us, after having gathered all these ideas of what stories we want to tell, what our audience wants to hear about. At this point, the define stage allowed us to use some logic in terms of what parts of the story were the most important, impactful, or riskiest, that we've narrowed down that our story needs to include these things and needs to focus on this part of this part of the problem. So you have a better idea of what your narrative is going to be about. What are the key points that you have to hit in your narrative? And so you're going to ideate, right? So once you jump into the IDA session, you have a narrower scope than when you started, right? And you're going to be fleshing it out. That's kind of like the second part of the design process, where you're now adding a bit more detail. So in this case, one of the techniques that I've used to bring my story to life, now that I kind of get a sense, it's like, okay, I know I want to talk about storytelling. Now what do I want to say about storytelling? So one of the things is this technique of what is your one sentence message. So before you start saying all the things you want to write about, it's like, what is the one sentence you want people to remember after your presentation? And that can be kind of like that hypothesis, like that big statement that you work to break down into further points and data and evidence to make your overall point. So in this case, you're doing you're creating a tool for a specific solution, and you're wanting people to remember that, we knew our process, and our solution was right because of these 2 reasons, or our solution is so impactful because of these reasons. If that's the message you want people to remember, that's your starting statement, essentially. Not your starting statement as in the presentation, but how you start planning your narrative. So start with one sentence that you want people to remember about your presentation. Then you break it into supporting points. It's okay, in order for people to believe me, or in order for people to capture this message, what are 3 things that could help me explain that point? So in this case, for example, being meta and all, presenting this, storytelling, what is my one sentence message that, leverages the design process to create your own stories? What are my supporting points that, in normal storytelling, there's empathy and it's connecting to the audience. And in design process, there's also connecting to the audience and the user. There's like, how do we do it? Like, now I'm walking you how to do it specifically. So like, that's how I started, from knowing that storytelling and the design process is kind of like the message I want to leave, and then how to break it down into like what the storytelling is, like how to do it, and those supporting points to that message. um, Something that I do at the stage of ideating, again, you start with one sentence, you break it into 3 points, and all of this, I'm seeing it visually in my head. I'm should have probably included an image that reflects that, but I'm using Miro in this case. Like, I'm using Miro, I'm putting one sticky with a big idea that maps to 3 stickies with the supporting ideas, and then the supporting ideas break down into the specific points or evidence or images or supporting facts that help me make that supporting point. So I'm using this tool because it helped me visually organize my thoughts, and it allows for flexibility, because like, as you start building a narrative, you'll find that, okay, we want to say this, and then we say this, and then we say this. And as you start planning that, sometimes you get stuck and you're like, wait, how am I supposed to connect these two thoughts? And that's where you realize like the narrative is not intuitive, and you're able to be like, okay, you know what, I think this actually fits before these two sections, because it ties better with the previous question, and I know how to connect it. And so using creative tools like Miro, Mural, Figma, FigJam, like anything allows you to like get scrappy and move things around and see things visually, will help you plan a narrative a lot better. And that brings me to the point of practicing at a high level. Like, sometimes we think that practice comes all the way to the end. It's like, in design process, testing comes to the end, and that's not necessarily the best approach. Like, testing comes in every stage of the of the process to some extent. There's a way to involve other people. In this case, the one thing I do is that I bring someone else that maybe is like slightly familiar with what I'm doing, or unfamiliar, let's say, and I kind of walk them through the sticky notes, telling my narratives like, okay, well, I want to start with this, saying this because I want to hit these 2 points, and then I continue and I say this. As you start practicing explaining something to someone, you immediately start spotting the holes in your logic. You start spotting the things that are not connected, and they ask you questions about like, wait, like, you see also the confusion in their head. You'll see the confusion in their faces, where like, yes, I mean, you're like, oh, you didn't understand how I connected those two, because I don't get it either. And you kind of understand how to fix or make your narrative a bit stronger. So what I'm saying is that at this point you can practice. This is a good point to bring someone else, or like talk about the narrative out loud, to spot those parts that are not serving the narrative. Then we go into prototype and test. This is step 4 and 5 technically. But okay, so now you have, let's say, a board of sticky notes with a narrative, or it could be a Word document with like indentations to indicate structure. Now, how do you make it real? Like, how do you actually build a presentation or build something, an outcome out of this? Because your story may not necessarily be a slide deck. It may be just a story that you're telling, a script that you're making, a video. Could be many things. But at this point, you're putting visuals to the narrative, right? So the reason why I recommend doing something what I'm describing, again, not doing the best job at painting this picture, because my pictures are not reflecting what I'm saying, but once you build this narrative in this kind of tree form that you can kind of map from like high level, like if you go a little more into detail, how to make those points, you can start understanding for each of the points that you're making, what kind of information do you need to show? What kind of visual, text, video, anything that could help you make the point that you're trying to make. And so, for example, in this case, let's say as I planned this particular presentation, I wanted to hone in on the questions and the resources and tips to ask yourself at each stage. And so in my sticky notes, it's like a bunch of sticky notes about each process and like all the things that you do at each stage. But then for my slide, I didn't want to build 20,000 slides. I built one slide that captures the key points of that stage. So like the resources that you may use, the questions that you may ask yourself, and some tips. So again, like you can start putting in the think of the stage as like the wireframe stage. You're not actually building the full on like beautiful slide. You're actually starting with something scrappy. I also do that in Miro, where like we start with like a square and we say, okay, in this square this kind of information lives, and an image like this needs to be in this slide. We don't know how, but it needs to be there. And then you start scrappy again, not letting your design pixel perfect brain to come in yet. It comes in later. And this allows you to start understanding like how much work needs to be going into making the slides, like how many people need to be involved, like how to divide and conquer the slides so that you can complete them. Yes, I love the sticky note idea for visually organizing the narrative, especially if you're having trouble creating points. Yes, 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 yes. Visuals, anything that is you can see helps you resolve narrative issues, or even find alignment as a team. Like you might be telling the story and people are nodding, they thinking they're understanding, and then you put in a sticky note and they're like, wait, no, that's not what I had in mind. So visuals are always just a great resource for finding alignment as a team. Okay, going back here to prototyping, we're thinking of this as a wireframe stage where you're working on slides at like a very high level, not in that like visual level yet, to understand the components and the different pieces of information that are needed at each stage. You can divide the work better because you look at, okay, there's 40 slides, you need to take 10, I need to take 20, I'll take the imaging ones. Like it helps you plan a little bit better. But then once you have hashed out what that like wireframe of your presentation is going to be, or your, if it's a script, like what are the different like sections that you need to complete, what are the different like scenes, like wireframe allows you to give you like a rough idea of what the final outcome will be. You actually go and put it into like a more high fidelity version. In this case, that's why my first point, and it's like the last point I'm making right now, is leveraging existing stuff. Like I'm a person that I am creative, but I'm not a fan of visual design because I go down rabbit holes and it takes me forever. And I know there's people that are much greater than me. But so that's why I go into places like this. Like I'm leveraging a Canva template to just like fast track my process of creating this presentation. People have done this groundwork of creating stuff. I don't need to. So this is where I tell you, go to Canva, go to Slide Carnival. They also have amazing templates for Google Slides or for PowerPoint, or just Google search template for slides, and you'll get a bunch of resources. I'm telling you, or even Figma. There's a lot of Figma resources for presentations if that's where you want to present. And a lot of people in my team have done it. I haven't done it yet, but it's a great resource actually. So, okay, templates. Leverage things that exist to translate your wireframes into high fidelity outcomes. I've already talked about what visuals best support your points. That's how you create your wireframes. Okay, let's go into practice and get feedback. Let's think of this as like the test stage of the design process, right? So you've created a prototype. You could also test that one and get someone from the audience, a mentor, which mentors are available. Why not? Get them to see your wireframe and be like, hey, does this narrative make sense? Or walk them briefly, high level, through your narrative to see if it's making sense. And like the same thing that you did with sticky notes, now you're doing with the wireframes, and patch the holes. So getting feedback. Then also on the side, you're practicing, right? You're practicing as a team, you're practicing individually. There's two levels of practice, as I don't know if I've said yet, but I see two different levels of practice. One is to like fix narrative issues where like you can stay at a high level. It's like, okay, in this slide, I want to say something like blah. And you continue fast, like you go through each slide fast, just hitting the points at a high level, and you can see, okay, wait, no, let's switch the order of the slides, or like, I think we're missing a slide here to connect these dots. That's high level. But then you also should or want to, I recommend that you do practice like as if, a dry run. That's what we call it, a dry run. You want to, okay, now you have your slides, who's doing what, what high level points are you're making, but you should probably know how you want to articulate them to the audience. Now set some time apart, not at the last minute. Don't do that. Please, don't follow my example. It's a bad one. But set some time apart to actually dry run, like practice it. And even if you make mistakes, it's okay. Sometimes I've done dry runs with people who are like, oh, well, I think I don't have it done. It's like, no, don't worry. Just try again. And what we're trying to measure there is, one, timing, right? So like, are you going to hit the time? How much time is it taking you to do all of this, right? So you might realize that you're way under time, and you're like, okay, we need to expand. We can expand on these certain points that are important, and we are not dedicating enough time to it. Or you might be doing way too much. You might be like, okay, if we had to take something out of the story, what would it be? Usually it's things that don't break the story. Like if you take it out, the rest is still pretty understandable. Like think about it, or reduce the complexity with which you're explaining those points. So again, dry runs are for timing, understanding timing, but also to understand like certain ways in which you're articulating your points, right? I've done dry runs since my first presentation at TWG was with a big client. I was like, okay, I am really intimidated. Let's dry run it so that I feel prepared. You can give me guidance. My design lead could give me guidance. My PM could give me guidance. And so we did it. And one of the things that was really helpful from that is that they like, for example, I would say blah, 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 blah. And they're like, okay, you took 3 sentences to try to say this one idea. I'm like, oh, interesting. That's awesome. And so they would coach me into simplifying my products, being succinct, being going to the point, and talking about only the things that are impactful. So that's another really valuable thing of dry running. And again, you can do it as a team because, each of you has a different mind and you can provide feedback to each other. But also there's another opportunity. You can bring a judge or someone that could be a judge or someone that resembles a persona to help you spot those things, to those quick tweaks that you want to do to your story. So I think I have covered almost everything. Yes, we're at slide 20 out of 20. I think the one thing that I didn't put in a slide for some reason is just some last thoughts on how to tell a story effectively. It's it's not only about building the right story from a narrative and outcome or visual or material perspective. There's also that you are part of the storytelling. You're a component to the story. How you tell it, the things, your tone, your confidence, your pace are also components of a story. And so for that, I recommend that sometimes before you jump into a presentation in front of a lot of people, you might be feeling nervous, and there's a few techniques for avoiding that, or moderating it, controlling it, let's say. There's physical outlets to energy, like nervous energy, because it could also be excitement. You can jump, you can sing to a song you really like, you can rub up and down the stairs. A friend at TWG, one of the things that she recommended is this thing called the Superman pose, where apparently you just put your arms up and just scream, you're pretending that you're flying or something. And apparently that's kind of an outlet, and also you're pumping yourself up. There's also a few techniques around establishing a stable frame in your body. So planting your feet, planting your hands to give yourself stability and come off more concise, come off more confident about what you're saying. Some other tips from my team that they share with me is okay, it's interesting. We want to see that there's a consistent energy throughout the team. As you're telling your story and you decide, we want the audience to feel energized from this session. And then you come with that in mind. All of you are going to come with that tone and an energy that leads to your audience feeling energized. Or you want your audience to feel thoughtful at the end. And you're going to use that as a pace. That's how you set your pace. We're going to be talking slow. You're going to use pauses. You're going to take a sip of water for effect. That's what I recommend, and my team recommends, because again, by all means, this is me capturing what my friends and my team is saying. But you can, using that idea of being intentional about what you want people to feel, do, and think after your session, you can use that to design the way that your team energy, your team execution is about this presentation. I feel like those were the key points that I wanted to say. I'm going to pause now. I think I might be at time. But yes, let me pause now.
Thank you so much. That was so good. I don't know. I learned so much from it, Ariana. Thank you.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, and I'm sure many participants have learned a lot, and it'll be very helpful when they're presenting their designs to the judges. Yeah.
Awesome. I think there's one question that was on the chat that I didn't answer throughout my yes.
From Erica.
Erica, thank you. So how is the best way to address the limitations of your design without discrediting it? Right. So when I've been in presentations where I'm like, okay, I know they're gonna be asking me about this, and this is where we bring that idea of like anticipate people's questions, anticipate what the flaws are. Like, what are the flaws? When you execute a design process, you always have limitations: budget, time, people, and so before they ask a question, I'm like, well, you should have done this instead. I'm like, okay, that's a great point. Due to the limitations of our setting, let's be real, we had to like limited time, limited budget, limited people, and we had to do the best with what we had. The way we resolve this limitation is by identifying that, first of all, further action needs to be done here. We need to research this further. So like you kind of like set the steps forward, the steps that you couldn't do in this case. So you kind of like showing that you're aware that that's a weakness or like something that needs to be addressed, and you have a plan of how to address it forward. That's one way. Another way, saying like the way I justify or like the way I compensate is the word for that weakness, let's say, is by doing this technique. So let's say people are like, okay, well, we don't have data from our users. That's a big limitation. How do you know that you're hitting the right problem? Okay, but what we did is we got resourceful. We talked to like 5 people that could potentially match our persona, or we went online and we found some sort of secondary research or research that other people had done on this problem already, or we went on similar apps and looked for on the reviews. Like, this is where you show how you came resourceful about it. Again, you either show that there's a plan moving forward that you weren't able to do, but you know what should have been done, or you show like, this is the way that I went about it, scrappy or resourcefully. That's 2 things I would recommend.
Yeah, I think that probably be the question that a lot of participants would be wondering about, because that's one of the hardest one to answer, personally, for me at least. In terms of time, we're exactly at 4, so I think there's a design review session going on, so I think we have to wrap it up now. But thank you so much for coming out and giving a talk on the delivering the design effectively. Thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you for having me. I hope this was useful in some little way.
Definitely.
I'm just glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.